Hello everyone, and thanks for allowing me to come here, and hopefully you'll enjoy my presentation. So I'll introduce you to IoT or bypassing ISP and enterprise anti-DDoS systems with 90's technology. So my background is that I'm from Denmark, so I took a little trip here. I have more than 20 years of experience in the security industry, started in offense, then moved into defense. Like to mix it up because, yeah, getting to know your adversaries also help you how to counteract it. And in my spare time, I run around with a Canon camera and try to get a little away from the computers. So, for starters, this is not a talk on how to perform a DDoS or encourage to do so, but it's to give some insights into the threats. And in the presentations, there will be no cats. So I'll give some background on why I started this project, some protocol history, how some of the anti-DDoS solutions are implemented out there, legacy protocols, meaning UDP. I'm primarily focused on the volumetric attacks and versus the super modern IoT botnets out there. Protocol versus new versus old, and then taking down the world with MaxPain. So the reason that I started this was that I was working in a SOC in a large telco in Denmark doing anti-DDoS mitigations. And what I saw was that the attacks were so easily mitigated. And I was thinking, why is it that they're doing this? It's like they're not putting any effort into it. And usually what we could do was more or less to filter out anything from Russia and China, and 90% of the DDoS attack was gone. So this was where I came into the mindset of the MaxPain attack. So again, I started the research back in 2016, started collecting information on primarily UDP protocols to try to see what I could gain of knowledge of these, to see if the problem that I was starting to have in my mind could actually be implemented. So if we're looking back history, we started back in like the 1990s on UDP protocols starting being used for DDoS attacks. And now we're talking 2018, and we're still seeing these issues out there. We're still seeing the same protocols out there. They're coming new all the time. The latest one was the Memcached, who actually blew the barrier because it amplified with 51,000 times and resulted in a quite heavily and extensive DDoS attack. So what I started to also look into was these booters and stressors. These are the public services out there that people can go and buy a DDoS for a certain time. But what again I was seeing was that they were not putting effort into it because it works. In a lot of times, simple UDP amplification attack works perfectly. So why change? And also what I found out was that even a lot of these services use Cloudflare to protect themselves from DDoS. So a sample here was from a boot for free, where you could free or without any cost order a 30 seconds DDoS attack. And what I saw here was that they were coming from all around the world: Amsterdam, Hanoi, Nairobi, Prague, everywhere. So what they're doing is more or less just taking some public lists out there and just throwing whatever they can after the targets. And this again was what we've been seeing for a lot of time, is that a lot of these services are not actually doing any work. I'm not emphasizing that they should start to do it, but as I'll show later on, we are in a situation where we'll start to see some potential issues with this if the bad guys start to just do a little more work towards this. So again, botnets are taken down. This was the Europol who actually took one of the larger DDoS service providers down. So it can actually happen. But again, they are also hiding. They're hiding in a lot of ways. Their entire infrastructure, their delivery service are protected in locations where they're not sharing information. They aren't being shut down. But in some cases, DDoS attacks is not even a reason for doing this. Sometimes we just have GDPR, which can close down a service for some providers. So this is the enrichment.com, where if you come from Europe, you're not allowed to see it due to the GDPR. So here are the different protocols that I've worked with. What I've seen is that there is more or less 19 million plus services out there that could potentially be abused. What I've not done is that I've not checked if there were any rate limiting or something on it. But again, if a service can just be used for one packet or 10 or 20, it can still be a part of the bigger attack. And what is also interesting when you start to see it is that with Jargon, you send 1 byte and you get, in an average, 261, or that's the amplification, yeah, 261 again. And in the uppercase, you multiply by almost 7,000. So again, the effort for the bad guys is to use as little effort to get as much effect out of it. Then again, looking at it from the attacker's perspective, there are also some protocols that should be more rated or highly rated, like NTP monolith, because the attacker can affect the size. So they can go in with pre-work and actually add on to it, and that was the same that happened with the Memcached. The attackers were able to push up the amplification levels on it. And the numbers here, it's not easily seen here, but there is still shitload of it out there. Even though we know that this has been a problem for years, people are still putting vulnerable systems out there all the time and pushing new up again. So in my research, what I did was that the data here that I collected was the pure amount of data that amplified. I pulled out the UDP header from the calculations and only added into what was actually sent and received based on the data. And still what we're seeing now is that some of the most used one are like Chargen, it's SNMP, it's NTP, SSDP. Those are some of the services that are mostly used. We've also started to seeing LDAP for some years back. We are seeing Memcached now being used, but so again, from the attacker's perspective, if we started to do a lot more analysis on the data, or let's put ourselves in the mind of the attacker, that they need to look more into what can they use to actually accomplish their goal, which is to take down a site or a service or whatever they want to. So in, let's say, NTP monoliths, in general, where there is most NTP monoliths is Brazil. But then if you look at monoliths that amplify more than 1,000 times, you go to Korea. So with this data, you can actually optimize your attack much more. But it also shows that these are separated all over the world. And for example, LDAP, that has one of the highest amounts of LDAP servers that are public, is actually located on a Microsoft network. So again, all of these data, if they are used much more in a more, what can you say, analytics way, it actually can amplify the attack, or you can use much less effort than we're seeing today. Because the usual attacks are around from 10 gigabits and upwards, and they are running for an estimated from 10 seconds to 15 minutes. That's the primary amount of DDoS attacks that are running there. But again, back to the part where we saw that Russia and China were actually the most used. What is actually interesting is that the US actually has the most vulnerable service in all. So we have the green one, 31%, which is the US, 24% China, 18% Russia, 16% Brazil, and then we have Korea in the end. and on the global view, it still shows why some of these services are using China and Russia, because there is a big amount of data there. So it is a big issue towards it. And we need to start looking into a way to start cleaning up. So again, as we also heard on the keynote, is that IoT attacks are gaining more usage. And that is because it is becoming more and more mainstream. It's being implemented in a large amount of areas. In everything is put on the internet. So everyone is going out and saying that they're seeing an increase in the amount of attacks from these services, and that is correct. And the UDP volumetrics are going down, but that doesn't make them dangerous anyways. So again, around October 16, we had the Mirai, which actually started or broke one of the records, or some of the records on DDoS amplification attacks, or DDoS attacks in general, because it reached 1.5 terabit. And again, you need to be a rather large provider to be able to withstand such an attack. And that's what the bad guys are trying. They are always trying to push the boundary, the amount, the size of the attacks. So looking at it again from a bad guys and attackers' perspective, we need to look at the pros and the cons of the different protocols. So if you're using like legit services for like UDP, you have a bigger chance for these services not to be taken down. That is a pro from the attacker's perspective, because ISPs are less likely to take down a DNS server because they don't know the side effect of it than if it's a Mirai botnet. We've also seen a lot more effort on if it's malware or if it's botnet related in any way. There are groups starting up that are actually attacking these, figuring out ways to take these services down. A lot of the times also the UDP services, they have SLAs, meaning that the service providers where these things are hosted gain a lot bigger uptime, because you need to be up at all times with an NTP server or DNS server, because it's so vital to us. Some of the bad things is that you don't get a real insight to it. Because as an attacker, when you're monitoring, you don't necessarily know. The only way to know if your service is up is that you need to send a request to it and see if it responds. Where if you have a botnet, it all the time usually reports back and gives you some insight in how many are online, how many are prepared to use for these attacks. So the botnets and the legit services have pros and cons in between. And that is where, if the bad guys started to utilize this knowledge into their public services, there might be a few that already does, but it's not becoming mainstream yet, then it could gain a lot bigger issue than we have today. So a usual anti-DDoS infrastructure implementation at an ISP level are that there is a scrubber box at the ISP, and then you usually also have some on-premise boxes for filtering out traffic. So what happens is that when an attack occurs or is detected, then the traffic is being rerouted up through these scrubber boxes. So it's usually not an always on, but it's when an attack is detected, it will flip the switch, move it on to the DDoS scrubbers. And from there on, that was also what I was doing. You can then sit there and filter the good from the bad and try to filter out as much bad traffic as possible. So the rest amount of risk that goes through the pipe, because you also need to be sure that you don't close down for legit services, or then the local scrubber boxes are able to handle these attacks. And that is the part actually of the issue or the problem. So why is it that UDP attacks is even possible? And that is due to that we're still also having the second part of the issue is that we're allowing IP spoofing. So a lot of companies, ISPs, etc., networks don't have BCP 38 implemented. And by not implementing that, you actually allow yourself to spoof the IP traffic. And that is also where the UDP is so a fantastic protocol from that point, because you're just saying that my requests are coming from the point that I want to attack. Kaida is actually a good source, so if you haven't already seen this project, I would recommend you to go in and actually look at that, because they are doing a lot of work to try to identify the ISPs and the networks where this is allowed. So again, but the issue is that this has been pushed in the last 15 years or plus to actually try to get this implemented, but we're still seeing a lot of sources where they're not implementing. It could be due to the situation where a company wants to be able to fail over. So if they want to be able to fail over to another ISP, in some cases they need to allow this. So again, if we're looking at the Memcached, this is an example of like in newer time where we've seen a new protocol being highly abused. And we saw also a decrease in the amount. And that was actually because it's starting to give issues to the service providers, to the VPS services, to like DigitalOcean's, EC, Amazon, etc. So some of them started to actually block the entire protocol. So they're not allowing that to gain inside or outside of their network. But what I've also seen in the research is that we've started to see now that it's like flattening out. So it had like the media attention, then we were doing a lot, we're really focusing on it, but then after a few months, it's not in the media anymore, not that interesting. So then we start to look away from it. So there is still a risk left towards these. There are still around 22,000 of potential Memcached servers that are still available out there and able to be abused. So what is also interesting is that if you look at the average amplification size, and this is without bumping up the attack, actually sending something to fill out the cache so it will respond more, it shows that there is a 73 amount of average or amplification average on that. So it's still quite a big amount of data out there. And it is a service that can be, again, affected by the attacker. Another example is the LDAP. Connectionless LDAP were starting to be abused around 2016, late 2016. But again, looking at it will show that the bad guys are not actually doing any work. They're not doing analysis on it, because with LDAP, you have around 48,000 today servers out there that provide you with LDAP responses. But if you look at MS SQL, then you actually have 120,000. And with the LDAP, you needed to send 52 bytes. With SQL, you only need to send 1 byte. And you get a bigger amplification. So again, it shows that they are not actually utilizing the capabilities that are out there. This also shows that we have a bigger issue that we will see in the future. Because if someone starts to use this and actually do some mining on it, data analysis on it, then it will pose a much bigger issue. So during this research, I also started to look, everyone wants to have like something with IoT. So I was also looking into, are there any IoT protocols out there that actually has this issue? So what I found out was that there was a service out there, or a UDP protocol called COPE, which is an IoT protocol that are used usually for machine-to-machine communication. And it was designed in 2014, and again, this was where actually in their RFC, they state that this is a potential risk to be abused for DDoS amplification. And that was why I'm also emphasizing that we need to start not making the same mistakes that we've done in the past. A lot of these protocols will be there in a lot of years ahead. So we need to start finding ways to ensure that even though we're talking about a UDP protocol where speed is essential, etc., we need to secure it in some way to perform something so we don't reinitiate new issues to an existing problem. So in the beginning where I started to look at this, there were only like 6,500 IPs out there responding to this protocol. So it was like, okay, this is not like mainstream yet. It's okay. But then in between November and December, it actually started to bump. So from 1 month, it went from like 6,500 to 26,000. And I was like, what is going on here? Started to look the month after, and it just kept on increasing. And today, the latest stats on it shows that there are more than 200,000 of these services out there. And it was actually related to a technology in China that actually adopted this protocol, which made it mainstream. So I'm guessing that we will just see an increase in this over, the next a lot of years, because it is starting to be much more adopted. And usually when someone adopts a service like this, a lot of people will follow on. So this could be one of the next services that we will see being abused in DDoS attacks. It does amplify with around 16 times, a max of 97 times, but it's very similar in some ways to the SSDP because it is a client base, so it's moving around, and that's also where some of these protocols, where the server protocols like DNS, NTP, are not moving around so much. So when the attackers have the list, then they are easily able to keep that list, where with SSDP and a lot of the other client-based protocols, they'll move around with the dynamic IP addresses. So that was a bit of history. And now we go to the pinky and brain and how we could potentially take down the world on it. So going back to the picture before, the mindset was that the attacker sent their traffic through the scrubber box. And the scrubber filtered out all the volumetric attacks, and it was only maybe the layer 7 or things like that that actually was the things that the local ISP needed to remove. So what we're doing with the MaxPain attack is actually finding a way, or through analysis, moving in between or behind the perimeter of the ISP. So when you're within that perimeter, you suddenly bypass the entire scrubber box that should take the volumetric attacks and moving it to your back to the line speed. So you don't need like 1 terabit, 2 terabit, 100 terabit attack. You just need to hit the line speed. And then, even though there are implemented local on-premise scrubbers, line speed is the key part of it. So if the bad guys started to actually do some pre-target analysis on what it is, so instead of today where you're pushing a button and within seconds the DDoS attack starts, if the bad guys started to actually just do a little pre-analysis on their service, like normal OSINT information gathering, IP addresses, CDRs, ASN, trace routes, seeing how the traffic flow, geolocation, peering partners, port scan. One of the most funny things is to see that if you DDoS a service with DNS traffic onto a DNS server, it's actually in some cases harder to filter than if you're sending SSDP or UPnP traffic to a DNS server. So with this, it can show that you can, with the analysis, bypass a lot of these things. Then you have services like Cloudflare, which are really good. But again, there are so many ways to leak around where they leak information. And it's coming up all the time where we find ways to find the actual IP behind. Also sometimes, maybe instead of attacking the web server, if you know there is a mail server just beside it that is not protected by the Cloudflare, then you might be attacking that. And still gaining what you actually wanted to take down the service. So with MaxPain, the stages could be like this, and this is what we're going to say I built like a proof of concept on. Was the first stage is the collection part. Stage 2 is to do some pre-analysis on the data, and this is again looking at the volumetric analysis. Then you enrich the data, you store it. I used Elasticsearch for it, and you use that database to rescan the data all the time to ensure that you have the hosts that are actually responding, how much they're amplifying with, the amount of time frame, etc. And then you have the data search into it, which delivers a target list of what you're actually going for. So in my case, what I did was that I used some of the public available services where they already do port scans. So I didn't even need to do that work. But again, today to find a location where you can do an internet-wide search or network scan is easy. So Shodan was also really helpful. You can pull out data there, census, and then set map for the rest, for the services that I couldn't find on any OSINT feeds. So this is a bit hard to see, but what I then did was actually, these were the requests that I found were being used in the attacks, the standard queries for the different protocols. And then over here, I collected the information on what was the attack type, the victim, what port, protocol, the runtime. So I had like a way to also measure time, because when you're like trying to figure out which hosts are most essential to use, then time could also be essential for it. The amount of amplification, and in the research I also collected all the requests, the full request and the full response. So I haven't even started, that might be the next research, is to look at what data are actually leaked through all of these things. So in stage 3, there is the data analysis and enrichment. So what I had from the previous one was the amount of data, the IP address, the protocol, the attack type, things like that. What I'm then enriching it with through Logstash is like the country, the AS, name, number, and then I removed anything that didn't amplify with a factor 2, at least. And the essential parts that came out of this was the amplification factor, the sent bytes, the received bytes, time in milliseconds, the protocol description, country codes, IP addresses, all of these core information that you need to use to evaluate your attack. And when you then start to push that into a formula to see which protocols are most effective, gained on what is sent and what is received, I came up with my own little pocket formula for doing this, and saw that it's actually the ones with the least amount of traffic sent that will give the best, the preferred amplification protocol. So we have like Chargen, Sentinel, Monlist, MS SQL, which is actually funny because there has, again, as mentioned before, we haven't seen much of these being abused out there yet, but it's possible, and there are a lot of them, so we will see it in the future for sure. So then the stage 5 is we're going to say, the data search part. This is where it all starts to come together, because you say your tier 1 is as close to the target as possible, and then you move outwards in different steps. So like when you're throwing a stone in the water, you have the ripples. So a disclaimer before going to the next slide is that no animal, people, websites, or networks were harmed in the making of this. So it was purely OSINT information, and then compared with the research that I've gained. So I took richmond.gov as an example. And the first part in the tier 1, as close to the target, is within the /24 of that IP address. are there any services that can be abused? Are there anything there that I can use for my attack? In this case, there were 6 services available. There were NTP readvar, port map, DNS. And again, the readvar is not one of the preferred where you get a really high amplification, but the interesting part is that you get as close to your victim as possible. So in the tier 2, I took the CDIR that this IP address was within, from within the IP ISP, and then we start to see a lot larger lists. So now we have 1,600 NTPs, 1,500 port maps, 270 SNMP servers, etc. So again, we start to gain a lot of knowledge on what is actually in there of the data. Tier 3, I'm then taking the AS number and the announced AS number just around this and looking again. So this gives me a much or an even larger lists. And again, we need to think of that we don't need to hit 10 gigabit, 20 gigabit, 1 terabit. We just need to hit the bandwidth of whoever we're targeting. And that's usually today 1 to 10 gigabits. Within that, you're more or less likely to kick off everything. I know there are some like Dyn DNS that have much bigger, but they are not affected as much by this. But for everyone mainstream, this can still affect them, and anyone using ISPs for it. In tier 5, I'm taking the upstream AS numbers, because again, what I'm also seeing that the implementations are that it's usually on the gateway that the ISPs are implementing the anti-DDoS solutions. So there could be a lot of AS numbers within that. And also usually if it comes as close to the target as possible, it's harder to filter out. And then if you just take US as a tier 5, within the US, you have an even larger list, because that's also what some people are doing when they're doing the DDoS mitigation. They're saying, okay, I don't need anyone from outside the US to see my website. So anything that is not resolving to a US IP address, filter it out. But here it doesn't work, because you're within the country. So again, it's the ripples in the water where you gain more and more hosts the longer out you come. And then you have, in the end, if it should be evolved, then you can start using whatever is out there, just taking down the list of whatever is back. So again, with all this put into place, we have the MaxPain. And what I did was create a small, we're going to say, proof of concept code that simply takes the OSINT information, pulls the data, and gives the amount of services in each tier that this is within. So let's see. So I've anonymized the attack, so let's see. Oh. So I'm starting the, let's see. Where, there. It's being pushed to, there we go. We'll take Richmond. Just for the videos will also be up on GitHub. Let's see. They also need to be pushed. 2 seconds. Mic drop. So what I'm doing here is that I'm saying that my target, the tier 1, needs to be within the /24. I need to look 30 days back in my database. It could be 7, it could be 1, depending on how often it would be updated. So the next one is, what is the amplification that I wanted to achieve, or as a minimum? So let's say I want to try to find as many hosts and use as least effort as possible. But in this case, I'm saying, okay, amplification needs to be at least 10 times in the protocols. It has to, in the seconds, is that I'm estimating how big an amount of traffic that I can send. So I'm estimating that I can send 25 requests per second in this. And I know that in some cases I've seen up to some of these DDoS attacks where the attacker are able to have so big a core network to do the amplification or the spoofing that they can reach maybe 1,000 requests per second. So it can be used in the calculations. Saying that I want to see tier 1 and up to tier 4, and then taking the list or the IP address. So again, it starts by doing the open source intelligence, gathering information about the network. Then it starts to pull out these. And in this case, I've just tried to see how many hosts are there, not how much they amplify, data like that, but it could easily be, what can you say, weaponized to perform a lot more of these informations. But it's estimating that within the tier, I just need to go a bit up again. So within the tier 1, I might only be able to do around 0.5 megabit of traffic. So that's not much, but it's a beginning. I'm then moving into tier 2 data, where then I'm hitting around 304 megabits per second. So again, it's about bumping up the traffic all the time, getting your target list or your attack list prepared for it. And then when you have tier 3, then you're hitting around 4 gigabit per second. So now it could start to actually gain some or do some pain on it. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. So it's being added. It was more in my collection of data to have the amplification. I pulled that out because it's more or less static around the 33 bytes, plus minus, depending on the IP address. So yeah, so that's adding to it. So again, in some cases, usually these services hitting around the 1 to 10 gigabit connections. So again, we're starting to increase the pain, and then in the end, we move outwards. And we have, in the last tier that I've collected here, almost 10 gigabits just on that. So again, this shows that with the pre-analysis, you don't need the large amount of traffic. You just need to actually optimize it. So going back to the... So again, this issue, I've only shown it for UDP services, but if someone started to adopt botnets into this calculation as well, so they both had the UDP and the botnets, they could probably gain an even higher amount of attack size on it. So if you added Mirai botnet into this, again, a lot of the infections are as close to the victim, someone even on the local networks that can be used to do these attacks. So again, I'm only seen it from the point of UDP because that was what I could prove or show. Didn't want to build my own botnet, or I wanted to, but there were some legal issues in regards to that. So what can be done? Actually, the only thing that I found, and that was also why I love to talk here, because we need to start thinking on what the hell do we do towards this, is one of the first or key parts is digital hygiene. We have like in Europe, we have like BGP ranking at circle.lu, but we also have here in the US shatter servers, which are doing an amazing job. And they are alerting people all the time. So we need to start putting some more pressure also on our ISPs, because a lot of the issues are in that network or in our neighbor networks or wherever we're seeing these issues, because we need to start taking it down because it can be a liability to ourselves. And a second thing that I started to think of, do we need to start to do similar things like with the spam house block lists that we've done with mail for so many years, is that we pull out, actually say, okay, if you have a service that is sending out spam, then we don't want to talk to you. If we started doing this with services or providers that were not having digital hygiene, to in that way enforce them, start to enforce them in a way to filter out the traffic or clean up their networks, because there aren't that much money in contacting different customers and telling them to fix their systems. But we need to do it in some way, because we have an issue here that's been going on for 20 years and it's not going away, it's only getting worse. And then of course again, if any one of you haven't implemented BCP 38 yet, please do. At least stop being a part of some of the, or parts of this problem. Of course, this doesn't help you with the botnets, but at least it helps you with the UDP services and other vulnerable services out there. So in the end, I'll say thanks to Rapid7, John Hart especially, because he helped me with actually doing a lot of the scannings when I had some services that I wanted to get some insight into it. They helped out with their scans.io project, which has now actually moved. SSD VPS in Denmark for allowing me to do port scanning on the rest amount, and Michael Vingård for doing a lot of sanity checks on this. The core data set of this for 2016 and 17 are released. It's public for you, so if you want to get some more knowledge into this, search for your own data, etc., please do so. I'm opening up GitHub later today, where I'm also having like the Elasticsearch database, the setup that I have there, the Logstash. For the ones that don't like JSON output, I also made a small Perl script that will convert the JSON to a PCAP, so if someone wants to play with that. And as promised, no cats, but we all like puppies. Thank you.